We came for salvation. We came for family. We came for all that's good. That's how we'll walk away.
Aloha and welcome to the Layman's Lounge podcast, a ministry of the laymanslounge.com, where we exist to bring everyday theology for everyday life. And you know that Thanksgiving hits that realm. What's Thanksgiving? Who are the Pilgrims? Should we cancel it? What's going on? Today we have on the show Dr. Thomas Kidd. Dr. Kidd is the Distinguished Professor of History at Baylor University. But I just got a text message from my pastor, my former pastor. He said, hey, the news just came out that Kidd is moving from Baylor to residential faculty at Midwestern Seminary. He was visiting faculty. You should start by asking him that. It is big news in the geeky historian world. What kind of historian vibes are going to be happening over there?
Oh, it's just great. I mean, it's just an exciting environment at Midwestern. And like you said, I've been there as a visiting professor for 3 years, but, really excited to be finally moving to Kansas City and, as dynamic church history, but also biblical studies and languages and all that. So we're really excited.
Right on, brother. So he is the author of a dozen books, including, just to name a few, God of Liberty, A Religious History of the American Revolution. Another one is The Great Awakening, The Roots of Evangelical Christianity in Colonial America. And then 2 volumes, just straight up called American History. Not even trying to get, I love it. It's like dates, like 1488, whatever. So that's pretty awesome. I've got a friend who saw that I was getting a review, and he wrote me on Instagram, and he's a bit of a fisherman in himself, and he nerds out on some of your posts, and he's seen some of those trophies, and he was curious, what's the biggest sea dog you've ever hooked?
Oh man. Well, we went out into the Gulf a few years ago, and we limited out on king mackerel in about 30 minutes. And so the guide said, you guys want to go get some sharks? and I was like, yeah, that sounds great. My boys were, of course, were like, yeah, man, let's go get it. So he said, no, understand, we're not going to try to land these sharks, but one of them had to be, I don't know, 7 feet long. And we got it up to the top, and then it, thrashed and broke the line and everything. But I don't know how much it weighed, but that was the biggest ever. And
let the listener know that Dr. Kidd currently has a 2-inch shark tooth earring on his ear right now. That is clearly is that. That's that shark, right?
Not true.
All right. So can we define terms like a pilgrim? Who's a pilgrim? I think we always hear they're like Puritans or something. Like, what's a pilgrim?
Yeah, I don't think that the people we think of as pilgrims would have called themselves pilgrims. There is this famous line from account of the settlement of Plymouth that they knew they were pilgrims, but that term really starts to be used in the 1800s, long after they found the Plymouth colony. So that group of people are separatists, and they were certainly called separatists at the time. The separatists just thought of themselves as faithful believers, but they were. It's pretty easy to understand what the separatists were about. They were believers who thought it was incumbent upon true believers to separate from the Church of England, which they thought was reprobate. And so they're theologically similar to the Puritans. But the Puritans at least professed that they were still trying to reform the Church of England. And so, purify, right? So they're staying in and purifying the Church of England, where the separatists are separating from the Church of England. And the problem with that in the context of England in the 1600s is it's illegal to start your own church. So they were really badly persecuted. And so the people that we call the Pilgrims were separatists in England, and then a group of them went to the Netherlands for a while, and then in 1620 they founded the Plymouth colony in what became Massachusetts.
So you had said that I had seen you say somewhere else that the Puritans were also called like precisionists, and the word Puritan was like sort of a derogatory mark. And precisionists, that's actually a good name. I kind of get it. Do you think like were they majoring? I truly don't know this stuff. Were they minoring on minors, or was it really a big deal? Like what were they trying to purify, like specifically? Just any like resemblance of Roman Catholicism, or was it like I know it was important to them, but was this like some stuff that looking back we're like, whoa, you're really gonna like maybe freeze to death for that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think from a Reformed theological perspective, there were definitely problems in the Church of England that had to do with the church hierarchy, Archbishop of Canterbury and all that kind of stuff. So they wanted to have maybe either a Presbyterian or Congregationalist model of church government. And then, of course, they're concerned about Arminian theology in the Church of England, which was not universally accepted, but was coming on strong in the early 1600s. And then, there's issues about, ceremony that they thought was too popish, quote unquote. Kneeling at communion, the garb that the priests would wear and things like this. So, whether you think that their complaints were legitimate or not, just depends on what you think about all that stuff. But it is, I think it's a more acute issue when you're talking about that you have an established church. The Church of England is the official tax-supported church in England then, and it is today, for whatever good that's done for them. But when you're being forced to attend and forced to support financially a church, I mean, it's a lot more acute about whether these kind of holdovers from Roman Catholicism are of concern to you. And the default is for all English people in the early 1600s that this is your church. I mean, there's no other option. And it's seen as an extremely severe and provocative move to just up and start your own meetings. And so this is one way culturally in which they're just, very, very different from kind of modern day America when, people think, well, you can start your own churches if you want over whatever issue. Right. The color of the carpet or whatever it is, you can just up and start your own church. You could not do that in early 1600s England. And if you did, it became a law enforcement issue.
Right. So I guess it's like question sort of two parts, like I'm trying to gauge who these people were. Like, is there a modern equivalent to them? Like, what were they reading? Were they reading Calvin, or like what were they reading? Like, what's the closest thing that we have today, if you will? I don't know if that's even a thing now.
Yeah. I mean, they would read Calvin in English translation, the classics of the Reformation for sure. They would be more on the Calvinist side of the Luther Calvin divide. And so, people like Zwingli and those sorts of people. So, I mean, they're deep Reformed tradition type people. This is chronologically, this is before the Westminster Assembly and all that. So just to put it in a little context, I mean, but they would be part of that type of, English Reformed trajectory that's going on. And so, part of what they're thinking is, do we stick it out in England as bad and difficult as it seems to be? Or do we, try to make a clean break? And the ones who make the clean break first go to the Netherlands, because the Netherlands offers religious liberty and something like a modern form. So they're just going to be left alone there and not persecuted. But then they get worried about, even the religious culture of the Netherlands and, that some of their children may be kind of drifting away. And so they decide to go to the New World as a way to, be more isolated. So, there would definitely be some resonances in terms of, the usual roster of sort of Reformed congregations or denominations today, PCA, OPC, something like that. But I think what's different is that, those denominations face cultural pressures like all traditional Christians do today, but not an establishment, right? I mean, and so that's the challenge that they're dealing with in the 1600s that we would just find really unfamiliar, is if there was only kind of one church to go to, and then battling for the future of that national church. I mean, that's a very, very different kind of situation for Christians to be in. And so, the going to the New World is a way of sort of getting out from under all that problem. And that's true of the Puritans too, who come to, a group of Puritans come to Massachusetts 10 years after the Pilgrims come to Plymouth, and the Puritans found Massachusetts in 1630. And they don't say that they're separating from the Church of England, but that's basically what they're doing. I mean, because it takes, 6 or 9 months to get across the Atlantic Ocean. And so they just really can't functionally be under the thumb of the Church of England anymore if they go to Massachusetts. So, we of course fight like cats and dogs about, Reformed theological issues and, creeping Arminianism and things like that. But I just think it's a lot different when you have, archbishops of the church who are agents of the state, telling you what you're going to believe about grace and salvation and how you're going to participate in church life. I mean, we're all much more individualistic and sort of market consumers, than they were at the time. And that has trade-offs about, there's good things about their system and there's good things about ours, and bad things about their system, bad things about ours. But that to me is how we're in a very different kind of cultural situation than they are.
Sure. If Luther were to nail up his 95 thesis in Wittenberg, right, and then maybe some of these, I forget, Scrooby or something like this in England, if they were to nail something up at the Anglican church door in Scrooby, what do you think would be the key points? And if I'm hearing you right, it's mainly the specific theological issues, but falling under the umbrella of the fact that they're not free to do them because they have to follow the sanction. So is that like the main thing, or is there any like very specific theological points that they were like, man, we've got to have this, we can't fold? But you're a historian. I don't know, if that's something you're that familiar with.
Yeah, sure. I think it would be clarity about salvation by grace alone. It would be, there would be 3 or 4 things. It would be let's be utterly clear about salvation by grace alone. Let's get rid of the elaborate church hierarchy, and the enormous expense that comes with that. I mean, because it's a tax supported deal, and it funds bishops and archbishops and cathedrals that you don't feel part of. And so there's like in the Reformation, there's a criticism of the church establishment as being corrupt. And then the ceremonies of kind of every Sunday parish church life, of some pretty technical things about the garb that the priests would wear, but suggesting that the priestly class is separated from all other believers. And that to them is a clear mark of Roman Catholicism. And they wanted to get rid of that and say, priesthood of all believers.
Okay. So I resonate with a lot of those things. So you had mentioned that some ended up going to the Netherlands, and then I think they ended up going back to England, and then they came here, but they all didn't. What do we know, if anything, about the ones who stayed?
Well, I mean, the ones who stay are facing, severe persecution. And so there's some of them that are thrown in jail, and that story continues on through people like John Bunyan later. But the ones who stay, have to figure out some way to either face persecution and just deal with it, or meet secretly, or whatever it's going to take. But if they're going to remain separatists, it's going to be a pretty tough situation, especially for the separatists. Now, the Puritans, I think, have a more hope that they'll be able to still fit somehow within the Church of England. Mm-hmm. And things, of course, look even more promising for the Puritans when you get to the English Civil War. The monarch had been persecuting them, and his minions in the Church of England had been persecuting them on through the 1630s. But they get a chance for about 20 years in the 1640s and 50s under Oliver Cromwell to kind of run things the way they want. And then there's a backlash, and that's in the Restoration when Charles II, restores the English monarchy. And that's when things get really, really bad for the Puritans. And the hundreds of Puritan pastors are basically fired and, removed from their churches and all that. And, you might say, well, how can they do that to these people? Because it's an official national state church, right? And so they serve at the discretion of the state. It's as a Baptist, this is not good, right? This is a bad situation for the church. And so you can have what was called the Great Ejection in 1662 of all these Puritan pastors who are let go and fired by the state because they're Puritans. So it can even get pretty bad for the Puritans, but we have to keep in mind the Puritans are a step more moderate than the separatists are.
Right.
I mean, the separatists are the real, at the time, just fanatical, radical type, English Reformed believers.
I love that you said "let go." I'm sorry, we're gonna have to let you go, Pastor.
Yeah.
So you've got these radical separatists. They're like, all right, this ain't working. We're going to the Netherlands, but the Netherlands is like, these separatists are like homeschool vibe. They're like, we're out of here, even though it's freedom. We're not into this scene. So they come back to England with the goal of going to North America. And if you could correct if that's wrong, but if that's wrong, having said that, was North America like the only option? Like why did they choose North America? And who in the world gave them a ship? And who in the world manned that thing? Who was like, yeah, we'll do 9 months that way.
Yeah. Well, it's rough. I mean, so on the North America question, I mean, they're going to go somewhere where England has political colonial authority. And so that's basically the East Coast of North America. Now, it is true, I mean, that there were some Puritans, for instance, who went to places in the Caribbean, where England also had, colonies on islands. There was a really notable Puritan colony in the 1630s at Providence Island off the coast of Nicaragua. And so, I mean, they could go to some, mind blown, right? But it got destroyed by the Spanish. So there was potential problems if you tried to set up next door to Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and Central America. But they're mainly going to go where there is English colonial power, and so they're not going to go to some place where a Catholic power is in control, because they will not be welcome there. So it is a bit of a balancing act that they're still somewhat dependent on kind of English colonial and military power, but they also want to go somewhere where they'll be left alone. The Plymouth colonists, it was complicated about who they're going to get to take them. And one of the boats that they ended up getting on in England was not seaworthy, and so they ended up having to all pile onto the Mayflower. But it's just basically a commercial ship that they hitch a ride on, and they thought they were going somewhere north of Virginia, but probably somewhere around what became New York City. But they kind of drifted off course, and navigation is not utterly reliable in those days for sure. And so they just kind of ended up landing at Cape Cod. Yeah.
All right, get off.
Yeah. And so, yeah, it's time to get off now. Although actually they when they got there, they weren't able to establish a safe colony and habitable colony. So they actually stayed on the ship for months. It's a horrible situation, terrible deprivation and all this. One of the early founders, his wife committed suicide, jumping off into the ocean and everything. I mean, it was just bad. Oh, wow. But anyway, no, it was definitely not on purpose that they ended up in Plymouth. It's just kind of happened to be where they landed.
I don't know if I love this interview or I hate it, because I'm realizing that I really am a product of like the California school system. I'm like, yeah. I didn't know any of this. The only stuff I knew was wrong. The things that I did learn is wrong.
The big question is whether they had turkey at the first Thanksgiving or not.
Did they have turkey?
Well, the answer is we don't know. There was a single reference to them eating fowl, but fowl doesn't necessarily mean turkey. So we know for sure though that they ate eel.
I read that you said that they
they ate eel. So we know that.
Keep the tradition alive, listeners. Go grill up some eel. Another question about like the colony. So it's maybe not even necessarily a Pilgrim question, but so could any like band of like chumps from England just be like, hey, we're gonna go to North America on the coast, and we're just gonna get some land, like like in America, the expansion, like they would, they're homesteading, they'll give you some land and a mule, whatever. Are they paid to do this, or they're just allowed to? Did they cover their costs? Or when they get there, like, so they arrive in, Rhode Island or wherever, what are they thinking? Like, clearly there's some natives living here, and are they thinking, oh, we'll just assimilate with them, we'll convert them? So there's 8 questions in one for you.
Yeah. So, it's a very loose situation as far as who can settle where. Obviously you're not going to be met by the Border Patrol or something when you show up on the coast. But if I remember correctly, the Plymouth colonists did get permission from the Virginia Company to do what they were doing, but the Virginia colony, I mean, like, nobody knows what the borders are of Virginia. And so if basically what they're saying is, somewhere kind of to the north of Jamestown, you all can settle there. But, I mean, like, exactly where could be within hundreds of miles.
Yeah, you go towards the flatland and you
go. Yeah. So as a legal matter, I mean, you were supposed to get either permission from an existing colony, and in 1620, that your option among the English colonies, on the North American mainland would be Virginia, and then the Puritans in 1629 actually got their own charter for the Massachusetts Bay Company, and that was John Winthrop got the charter for them. So, I mean, it's not that, I mean, there are tradesmen and, fishermen and so forth. They were coming around and, doing their thing and then leaving. But if you want to set up a colony, you would probably be well advised to get permission from somebody official, or else, you might get a visit from the English army or something like that, telling you to leave or we'll kill you. So as far as the Native Americans go, yes, that there, of course, was a fully developed population in North America when Europeans start coming around. As far as Plymouth goes, there were Native Americans living in the area, but where they actually build the Plymouth settlement was a former Native American village that had been abandoned and depopulated and abandoned. And that's a pretty common story, that when you start having any European and Native American interaction in the very, very beginning of the colonial period, usually the first thing that happens is that there is a spread of epidemic disease among Native Americans who've never had any exposure to European diseases. Yeah. Most obviously smallpox, but also things like the plague and things like this. And so a lot of the East Coast villages are sort of decimated and depopulated, and the Europeans who come around, they don't really know, like, where did these people go? There seem to be huts and things like that around, but they're abandoned. And that was a situation with where they built the Plymouth village, was that there were, I think, a Massachusetts Indian village had been there, but they had abandoned it. Oh, wow. The people who had survived. And so they did end up through Squanto and another Native American kind of go-between. I mean, they did establish relations, kind of diplomatic relations with Native Americans.
So Squanto is real. It's not just
Squanto's real.
It wasn't just that wasn't false history. That was real. Okay.
No, Squanto's real.
Something was real.
Yeah, fascinating guy. I mean, he when they met him, he could already speak English. And I think that he had been taken captive some years earlier and sent off as a slave to Europe. And it ended up somehow making it back to New England. But along the way, he had learned how to speak English. Mm-mm. So, he approached the Plymouth colonists and was able to speak to them, at least in some basic English. Wow. And anybody like that is going to become, a diplomat, interpreter type situation, because the Plymouth folks don't speak Massachusetts and the Massachusetts Indians don't speak English. And so that part was real. But, so the Plymouth colonists have sort of okay relations with Native Americans. I mean, they do have something like this kind of first Thanksgiving meal, and it's a diplomatic ceremony, and kind of a harvest celebration and all that. But within about 3 years, there's already some pretty bad violence between the English and Native Americans. So it's not some paradise for sure, but overall they probably do a little better than your average English colony. And one other thing is on the evangelism issue. I mean, almost all the English colonists, they're all at least nominally Christian. And so usually as part of getting permission to have a colony, they would at least gesture towards evangelizing Native Americans. But usually there was not much substance behind that. So you really, until you get to kind of the mid 1600s in New England, there's not a whole lot happening as far as English evangelism of Native Americans. And part of the reason for that is that, especially with the Puritans, it's not too long before they settle, before you have just terrible wars between the Puritans and Native Americans. That, for instance, in the mid 1630s led to the almost total extermination of the Pequot Indians in southern New England. And so, it's kind of hard to evangelize people in that sort of, I mean, to make light of it, but it's very difficult to have missions and evangelism when you're also having conflict over land.
Okay. So in my mind, at first I'm like, oh, these separatists, these pilgrims, these are like the real deal, man. They're committed to the word of God and the church community. But now I'm a little bit confused. You're saying they weren't so stirred for the truth of the gospel. I mean, I know it's different now since the rise of the modern missions thing. So trying to separate that out, but I'm a little bit surprised to hear you say that. It's not that I would necessarily expect them to go out and evangelize, but I would just assume the posture was a full on, oh yes, I mean, we would love this. Do you know, Can you drill down on that anymore, or that's all we get is just that super high level view of they weren't having it?
Yeah,
Sounds like sounds like cage stage Calvinist to me.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so as a general rule, Protestants are not good about missions until you get to the 1790s. And so the long after the establishment of the Plymouth colony, and they're, that's just a global kind of fact.
Yeah.
It starts to change in the 1730s and 40s with the Moravians, who start to set, who are kind of the first Protestant group to start like planning and organizing more global missions. They're going to India, they're going to Greenland, and they're going to the Caribbean, and then in the 1790s you start to get the English evangelical missions movement. Before that, yeah, it's a real problem in terms of the profound limitations on missionary efforts among just about any Protestants. And it also pales in comparison to how much Catholics were doing in that earlier period. Catholics are much more aggressive about global evangelism and education than Protestants were. I mean, you could write, probably multiple books about why all that is, but I think that Protestants in this period tend to have a much more sort of beleaguered mindset about, we're kind of more trying to survive rather than, get. And the Catholics have a lot more infrastructure to draw on in terms of, the global reach of the Catholic Church, the financial wealth of the Catholic Church. And of course, some of those things are connected to how much you can do in missions. And I will say that, I mean, there are individual cases like John Eliot, the Puritan missionary in the 1640s and 50s, that he really makes very strong efforts to evangelize Native Americans and as importantly to translate the Bible into Native American language. But Eliot is somewhat of a kind of one-off situation. Most Native Americans, of course, don't speak English, and that's a really serious. And it's the same thing with slaves. I mean, the first generation of slaves coming in from Africa, a lot of Native Americans were also enslaved. If you've got, you've got the language barrier, you've got, these kind of competing economic interests about imperialism and slavery and all this kind of stuff. It's just not a situation that's very conducive to missions.
Right.
And so, one of the things that the missionary movement is always going to have to struggle about is its connection, usually to some kind of imperial concern. And it really wasn't until kind of the 20th century that the missionary community started to kind of fully reckon with, we're not trying to integrate these people into the British Empire, right? I mean, we just want them to be believers and be enculturated in their place and time. But the early American colonial ventures are just sort of the whole other extreme of just not a conducive. I mean, how are you going to evangelize the Pequots? They're gone, right? I mean, they've been destroyed by the English.
Whoa.
Right. So it's a sad story. I mean, especially from a believer's perspective.
Yeah.
But some of it, I think, is just attributable to, that kind of beleaguered, embattled mindset that they just don't have as much energy for outward focused outreach, evangelism, and missions.
Sure. Please tell me that Puritan missionary from the 1630s was the great grandfather of Jim Elliot. Just make my day. Please tell me that was a reality.
That's a great point. I've never thought about that. I don't think they spelled their name the same way, but maybe it got changed sometime over the generations.
So in the minds of these separatist pilgrims, they're like, all right, we're going to North America. They think they're going to Virginia. in their mind, what is a best case scenario? And with the driving factor of sort of freedom. Okay, now that we have our freedom, and then a friend of mine also wrote and he said, freedom for who? Like, what about the Quakers and the Baptists and the Indians, right? Natives, yeah.
Right. So the separatists, I think, do a little better on the score of religious liberty, in the sense that, they're not quite the persecutors that the Puritans were in Massachusetts. But, by the time you get to the late 1600s, Massachusetts has absorbed Plymouth. So the difference between the two communities is gone by the time you get to the late 1600s. So for the separatists, I mean, the most immediate ideal scenario is that they would be allowed to practice biblical religion in freedom, and they're not so interested necessarily in extending that to other people, but I mean, it's such a small place that it's just not, they don't have the kind of ambitions that, say, Massachusetts does to their immediate north and northwest. But if they're persecuted so badly in England, they think in Plymouth they'll just be left alone. And so one of the things that you see with both the Puritan colonies and Plymouth is they're facing questions that most Christians never have to deal with, which is, if you're able to from scratch create a whole new Christian commonwealth, what does the moral law look like in a civil sense? Right. And so do you enforce the Mosaic law?
Right.
And I mean, in America today, we put up monuments to the 10 Commandments and stuff like this, but the vast majority of Americans have no interest in enforcing the 10 Commandments in American law. Right. I mean, laws against idolatry. I mean, for heaven's sake, the whole American population would be in jail. Right. Laws against adultery. Observing the Sabbath, like Sabbatarian law, we have no interest in that sort of thing. I mean, except for, sort of Christian Reconstructionists. And so they really have to face those questions. I mean, because if you could start over, basically like if you created a colony on Mars or something like that, and you were completely left alone, would you institute the whole Mosaic law? Wow. And in Plymouth and in Massachusetts, they at least early on, they gave it a run. And so I mean, if the Mosaic law said it, they did it. And so there were, at times just extreme punishments for sexual immorality. They would really crack down on people for violating the Sabbath and things like this. But it's pretty tough to sustain, especially if you get any number of people in the colony, which you did both in Plymouth and in Massachusetts, who are not working the program. But I mean, in William Bradford's Plymouth Plantation, there's an account of a poor guy getting stoned to death for bestiality. I mean, wow, this is like a different. These are just not issues that most Christians ever have to think about.
Yeah,
but right. I've asked my students sometimes when we talk about colonial America, I'm like, well, you say you're a Christian, do you think the whole Mosaic law should be, the law of the land? I mean, it's most of us just don't ever have to really actually think about that.
This is blowing my mind right here.
So, anyway, sorry to have to bring up bestiality, but they stoned this guy to death.
No way.
So, that I say all that to say, what are they thinking is the ideal outcome? Well, a fully biblicist commonwealth, church and state all working together, to obey God and glory of God and everything. And it's very, very difficult to sustain over the long term.
Well, how would, for example, okay, say where they do that, but like even the way folks interpret scripture, right? Or, they live it out like a Baptist, or, even the mode of baptism, or the views like of the sovereignty of God, right? Because that was a huge reason as well. Would you get busted for that, or is that just like a fine?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Plymouth is a step more tolerant about those kind of things than Massachusetts is. And part of the reason for that is because Plymouth, almost from day one, Plymouth was founded in 1620. Boston is founded in 1630. And Boston is always bigger, and Massachusetts, there's just a lot more Puritans than there are separatists, because the separatists are so radical. And so they always feel sort of afraid of, the power of Massachusetts. And, there's an ongoing debate between the separatists. The separatists and the Puritans don't like each other.
Oh, wow.
Right. Because it's a fundamental difference about their view of the Church of England. So there are people like Roger Williams, for instance, who originally comes to Boston and to Salem as a Puritan minister, but he's very quickly developing separatist convictions. And so he goes and hangs out with the people in Plymouth, and is pastoring there for a while, and then goes back to Massachusetts. So there's a lot of shuttling back and forth, but by people like Williams, but there's tension between the two groups. And so the Plymouth folks, I think, are a little more sensitive about kind of religious toleration and all that. So the Puritans are not. I mean, the Puritans are not keen on, religious liberty for all. And I think that the reason for that is because they have just enough power to envision themselves as operating as an established church. And the truth is that the Congregationalist church, the Church of the Puritans, does serve as the established church in Massachusetts for 200 years, from the 1630s until the 1830s. A lot of people don't know that. Massachusetts kept an established church.
Oh, I knew that for sure.
Yes. Yeah, after the First Amendment, banned a national established church, Massachusetts kept on having an established church. And so if you're thinking as an establishment, then you're thinking there's one right church. It's not this kind of relativistic, who cares about denominations? There's one right church. Yeah. God has shown us in his word what the truth is about, church polity and doctrine and these kind of things. And so they say, no, we're not tolerating, these crackpot, Quakers and Baptists and so forth. And so they banned the Quakers, they banned the Baptists, because they say, if we tolerate people who, directly disobey the word of God as they see it, then we're just inviting the judgment of God on our society. Why would we do that? Yeah. And so they banned the Baptists, they banned the Quakers, and in extremely unfortunate episodes in the 1650s, they even execute some Quakers that they had kicked out repeatedly and told them, if you come back, we're going to kill you. And the Quakers, as they were wont to do in those days, were seeking martyrdom, and so they ended up getting executed. The Puritans are not keen on religious. They want freedom to practice biblical religion, but they're not going to give freedom to other people to practice, as they saw it, unbiblical religion.
Yeah. Dr. Kidd, how do you know all this, man? And then you've written books on Ben Franklin. Like, what in the heck? What is your wheelhouse? Like, what if I was to be like, what are the two things you want to talk about? Like, would you it's so interesting or compelling or whatever? I'm just, as a side note.
Yeah, probably the Great Awakening and George Whitefield and all of those associated issues, Jonathan Edwards, and then religion and the American founding. But some of this just comes from, I've taught at Baylor for 20 years and all these kind of courses, and, you just end up knowing stuff.
Thank you. All right, I'm closing out just a few final questions. This has been really, really helpful, and I'm ashamed. Man, I need to go read some more books or something. Goodness gracious. Okay, I'll ask this. So in an article I read that you wrote, you said this. the American colonies, particularly in New England, continued the tradition of holding Thanksgiving days into the Revolutionary era, when the new American nation also picked up the practice, end quote. So for these early adopters or people who ran with, Thanksgiving or whatever it was called then, I don't know, what historical events are they broadcasting back, if anything? Or what was like the filter or like the goal of this event?
I think they're drawing off of, Old Testament precedents of, the people of Israel gathering together and giving thanks to the Lord. And it does reflect, I think, that sort of establishment mindset that this would be something that the government would encourage people to do. You could imagine, I don't know, a church today, saying, thank God that we're getting past COVID finally, and we're just going to have a special Sunday service where, we have a festival and after, lunch after church and a big Thanksgiving to the Lord. And, that would make a lot of sense to us, especially from a kind of church perspective, but they would take that to more the town and colony and state and the nation level of saying we all together are doing this to thank God for his mercies. But it assumes that there's some kind of cooperative relationship between the government and the churches, and also that there is some sort of uniformity of religious commitment among the people in that political unit. And so that's where it's coming from. And George Washington, immediately upon becoming president, started announcing Thanksgiving services or, Thanksgiving days. But, before then, it wasn't necessarily like an annual kind of thing. It was more of an occasional sort of thing where it would be, at the encouragement of the churches, but the political leader would say, on such and such a date, we're all going to, set aside a day for Thanksgiving. And you thought, it was the right thing to do, but it was also a way to not be ungrateful for God's blessings.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's where it came from.
Sure. So these separatists, these pilgrims landed, and you're telling me that they're essentially ended up being the Congregationalists or whatever, and they were hated by the Puritans. So what? I realize I don't know anything about this. What became of them? So they ended up becoming friends with the Puritans. Like, where does who are who's in that lineage? Is it Cotton Mather and Jonathan Edwards? And what are some books we have from these people, or did they just get absorbed into the mass colony? Or
so the issue about separatism per se, that issue looks a lot different when you're living in the New World than it does in England. Because whatever problems they have, they're not going to have legal problems for having a separate meeting when they're living in Plymouth. And so in that sense, they got what they want.
Sure, yeah.
And so they over time start looking more and more just like kind of regular Congregationalist Christians. And in that sense, they're in a church polity sense, they're very similar to their neighbors in Massachusetts or Connecticut. And so they do eventually get absorbed by the bigger Massachusetts Bay Company. And by, the late 1600s, Plymouth is just a part of Massachusetts. Oh, okay. And so at that point, there you have sort of the Puritan movement is changing and becoming more like what it would be in the Great Awakening with the, kind of the new evangelical movement, revivalist movement. And yes, Cotton Mather is kind of one of the last of the Puritans. Jonathan Edwards is kind of one of the first of the new evangelical revivalist types. But all those people are Congregationalists in terms of the denomination that they affiliate with. And so that is, it's early Harvard, it's early Yale, it's Connecticut and Massachusetts and Plymouth and all that. And so the Reformed tradition in America and the evangelical tradition in America, really, I think the heartbeat of it in the colonial period is in that Congregationalist tradition.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I live in Hawaii, and 201 years ago is when Christianity first came here, and it came from like Yale. It came from the Congregationalists. So all these old churches, I'm like, why in the world? When I first got here, why are all these Congregationalists here? And so, anyways, that's interesting. Last question for you. You said in an article I read from you, American, and you had to know this question's coming, right? So here it is. Americans' general uncertainty today about how to observe and honor such occasions, the occasion being like sort of Thanksgiving, right? When much of the American and Christian past is viewed as ethically complex at best and an unrelenting tale of racist and imperial oppression at worst. That said, like, do we cancel Thanksgiving, to use the modern, the lingua franca, or do we like redeem it? Do we go out of our way to be like, yeah, this was whack? Like what do you think is, we want to be faithful, we want to be salt of the earth. We don't want to like be bootlickers. What's your suggestion?
We don't want to be bootlickers. So I think when people are observing Thanksgiving, there's only a kind of hazy connection to the history, right? The kids might wear whatever kind of hat or something. Yeah. It's less politically correct today to dress as Native Americans than when I was growing up. But so there's some kind of awareness about something about Turkey and, Plymouth Rock or something. But I don't think it's actually that much of a historical holiday anymore. And that's fine. I'm not going to be able to change that even if I wanted to. I think from a Christian perspective, though, it's totally redeemable in the sense that I think, the secularization of Thanksgiving in America has meant that it's just kind of a celebration of family and food and football and all that. And that's great. I'm all for all that. But for believers, I think that we can be a little more conscious and on purpose of the historic reason for Thanksgiving, which was, of course, Thanksgiving to God. This isn't like rocket science, but I like the idea of believers, using Thanksgiving to be more on purpose at the Thanksgiving meal or things, whatever cheesy family tradition you want to, going around and saying what you're thankful for. I think that's great. And I think that's a way for Christians to really manifest more fully the historic meaning of this. Is it's not just sort of this generic kind of Thanksgiving, but to whom we do not know. Mm-hmm. No, we know it's to the Lord. And so all the good things, and thank God for, somewhat getting past COVID and, and thankful for his blessings to us, all that's the Christian way of redeeming it. And there are very fine books to read about Thanksgiving and everything. And what you find is that, like all of history, it is morally complex. Yeah. And I'm not so keen on, us needing to have these sort of perfect heroes in the sinless heroes. We've got one of those, right? Yeah, a carpenter's son from Nazareth, right? It's no problem for us if the people in the past were a lot like us. They're just complex and flawed, and don't see all the problems with what they're doing. That doesn't do any damage to my faith. So that's what I think about how to, we should zealously be engaged in Thanksgiving, but just remember to be thankful to the Lord in a very overt way.
So good. So Dr. Thomas Kidd, as you're headed up to Midwestern, are there any, closing out with this, are there any books you're working on? And why do you think Abraham Kuyper is awesome and we need to recover him in America? Sorry, I had to ask it.
Yeah, well, speaking of that, I'm working on a church history since the Reformation book for B&H, and it does have a section on Kuyper and Bavinck, so you'll be glad to know that. Okay. So that's kind of what I'm mainly writing right now. But I'm also working on Before that, I have a book on Thomas Jefferson. Speaking of flawed American heroes, I have a biography of him. It's called Thomas Jefferson: A Biography of Spirit and Flesh.
Okay.
So it's not going to be controversial at all, but it'll be out, Lord willing, in May 2022.
Perfect, man. This was really enjoyable. Again, I realize I'm kind of dumb, but I'm glad you were able to teach us today. Happy Thanksgiving, and I hope you turn up some Amy Grant, because Christmas is coming, brother.
Thanks, Jason.
We came for salvation. We came for family. We came for all that's good. That's how we'll walk away. We came to break the bad. We came to cheer the sad.